Father Adrian Clark was the town's most trusted spiritual leader. Sister Margaret Doyle was the face of compassion and purity. But behind the sacred walls of St. Gabriel's Church, they shared a secret so dark it would destroy everything they stood for. What began as silent glances turned into forbidden rituals, and by the time the truth emerged, faith had turned into scandal, and devotion into obsession. This is the twisted story of a priest, a nun, and the sinful addiction that brought down an entire parish. Father Adrian Clark was the spiritual anchor of Harrowfield, a town wrapped in routine and tradition. Standing tall and articulate at 45, Adrian wore the cloth with a blend of quiet authority and theatrical charisma. Every Sunday, his sermons echoed through the hallowed halls of St. Gabriel's Church, drawing not just the pious, but also the skeptics and the broken. His voice, firm yet soothing, spoke of redemption, self-restraint, and divine purpose. Few knew of Adrian's past. Ordained in his mid-30s after a rocky youth filled with failed relationships and a dangerous addiction to sexual thrill-seeking, Adrian was transferred multiple times between parishes under quiet, unexplained circumstances. Each move left behind. Whispers and rumors, always hushed by the higher clergy. By the time he arrived in Harrowfield, his records had been sanitized. Sister Margaret Doyle was different. She carried with her a kind of magnetic repression. At 38, she was elegant, refined, and deeply intelligent. She had once been a philosophy student, debating theology at a graduate level before she abruptly joined the convent. Most assumed it was a calling. Few knew she had suffered a mental breakdown after the overdose of a lover, a seminary student, whom she had been involved with during her final year at university. That death, that guilt, had driven her to the church. Margaret took to her new life with the ferocity of someone trying to outrun a ghost. She immersed herself in prayer, work, and charitable service. But something in her had never truly healed. The arrival of Father Adrian, confident, kind, and radiating restrained intensity, stirred something inside her that she had fought to bury. They were drawn to each other, initially in small, silent ways. Shared glances, long pauses after, meetings. Mutual admiration cloaked in spiritual respect. But beneath the surface, a storm was forming, fueled by Adrian's deep-rooted addiction and Margaret's unresolved emotional scars. Together, they weren't just vulnerable, they were. Combustible. St. Gabriel's, with its Gothic arches and solemn statues, became their secret playground. What began as extended planning sessions and shared moments of scripture study soon evolved into something far more sinister. Late nights turned into locked doors. Candles flickered beside altar cloths as their bodies intertwined in places, meant for worship. The irony was not lost on them, but it only added fuel to their desire. The more forbidden it felt, the more electric it became. For Adrian, it was the high he had always chased. Sacred sin. For Margaret, it was an emotional possession, a love she felt justified in receiving after years of suppressing her humanity. Over time, their liaisons moved outside the church, abandoned school buildings, an isolated cabin owned by a former parishioner who had passed away. Even the rectory office, where official church paperwork was handled, became a backdrop for their late-night escapades. To the community, they remained exemplary figures. Adrian baptized children, led youth groups, and counseled troubled couples. Margaret organized soup drives, prayed with the sick, and attended confession like clockwork. but their inner lives were unraveling. Adrian's addiction grew more demanding. He began recording their encounters using an old cell phone, claiming it was for memories. Margaret was hesitant at first, but his intensity, his ability to make her feel needed, made her submit. Over time, she stopped resisting, but they were careless. Adrian left a flash drive in the church office one night, forgotten after a long session of confession and indulgence. That mistake would become the first crack in their false holiness. Emily Granger, a 23-year-old volunteer at the parish, was responsible for weekly clerical tasks. She stumbled across the flash drive while organizing donation receipts. Expecting sermons or tax forms, she opened it casually, and what she saw left her frozen. Blurry, grainy footage captured what could only be described as sacrilege. Graphic sexual encounters between Father Adrian and Sister Margaret within the sacred halls of St. Gabriel's. Emily panicked, shutting the laptop and rushing home, trembling with the weight of what she had just seen. Conflicted and terrified, she confided in her father, a retired police officer. He took the matter directly to the diocesan office. Within days, an internal investigation was launched under absolute secrecy. A retired bishop, Thomas Reinhardt, was brought in to consult, given his reputation for handling delicate scandals. Hidden cameras were discreetly installed. Additional evidence was gathered. Recordings, bank logs, and patterns of behavior revealed not just moral failure, but financial misconduct. Thousands of dollars misappropriated from the church's outreach funds, used to rent remote properties and purchase illicit supplies. The church could no longer remain silent. Bishop Reinhardt, hardened by decades of spiritual bureaucracy, made a quiet visit to Harrowfield. He confronted Adrian behind closed doors. Margaret was summoned separately. No one knows what was said in those conversations, but within 24 hours, both were suspended from their duties. The church issued a vague press release citing health-related sabbaticals. Behind the scenes, legal proceedings began, but things were already slipping beyond the church's control. Adrian vanished. When police came to question Adrian formally, they found his rectory apartment completely cleared, documents shredded, clothes gone. The only thing left behind was a broken crucifix and a blood-stained pillow, later confirmed to be from self-inflicted harm, not fatal. Sister Margaret, however, didn't flee. She had locked herself inside the wine cellar beneath the church, surrounded by empty communion bottles. When discovered by a maintenance worker, she was unconscious. An attempted overdose using prescription anti-anxiety medication and sacramental wine. She was hospitalized immediately. The church tried to minimize the story, but a local journalist caught wind of the emergency dispatch and leaked it online. Within hours, speculation flooded the town. A week later, Adrian was spotted in a seedy motel near the state border, living under the alias Robert Denton. He had dyed his hair, grown a beard, and used prepaid gift cards to stay off the financial grid, but addiction had made him careless. He used his real name to register for an adult webcam site on the motel's public Wi-Fi. Police raided the room that night. Adrian was found alone, intoxicated, and surrounded by stolen church relics and several SD cards, some containing more footage, others filled with detailed journal entries. He did not resist arrest. Clark and Sister Margaret Doyle became a national sensation. Live streams, podcasts, tabloid articles, everyone had an opinion. Some called them victims of repression. Others labeled them monsters in robes. Prosecutors revealed that Adrian had embezzled over $70,000 across 3 years, primarily from cash donations and youth group funds. Testimonies from multiple former colleagues at prior parishes hinted that Harrowfield was not his first scandal, only the one that finally exploded. Margaret's defense painted her as a psychologically broken woman manipulated by a compulsive predator. Her lawyers cited her history of trauma, isolation, and dependence on spiritual authority. Mental health experts supported her diminished responsibility. The verdict, Adrian Clark, was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for fraud, misuse of religious funds, and creating explicit material in sacred institutions. Margaret Doyle received a suspended 8-year sentence with 5 years of mandated psychiatric treatment and house arrest. Adrian showed no remorse. In his final courtroom statement, he claimed he had lived more purely in sin than most do in obedience. Margaret never spoke publicly again. St. Gabriel's Church closed temporarily. The parish, devastated by betrayal, lost nearly half of its congregation. Father Matthew Brenner, a kind but weary priest, was brought in to rebuild. The church reopened a year later, stripped of its grandeur, the stained glass windows removed, the altar replaced, the pews rearranged. Emily Granger, the volunteer who had found the flash drive, left town shortly after the trial. She declined all interviews. The church diocese never fully explained how Adrian had avoided earlier disciplinary action. Several higher officials quietly retired in the months following the case. Sister Margaret now lives in a psychiatric halfway house under an assumed name, surrounded by silence and shadows. And Adrian Clark sits in a high-security prison chapel, reading scripture each morning, perhaps as penance, perhaps for show. What happened behind the sacred walls of St. Gabriel's was not just a crime of lust. It was a collapse of conscience, of trust, of the very sanctity so many had believed unbreakable. In the end, the most terrifying part wasn't just the sin. It was how long they got away with it.